Morning. I figured out that it may be that absolutely nobody is watching this blog except for myself at this point. And the reason I say that is that yesterday I was excited to see that as I was previewing it in the dashboard on YouTube, that somebody else apparently was watching at the same time. And then I figured out that YouTube has a very strange way of counting the number of people that are watching a video. Apparently there's a lag sometimes. I don't know, maybe sometimes it's pretty much instantaneous, but sometimes it could take a couple hours or more for it to show up, which means that what I've been seeing in the numbers is myself. Uh, so that was discouraging. It had me kind of depressed for a while. And then when I get depressed like that at being rejected or shunned, which happened to Matthew a lot, I get defiant and I say, screw them all. I'll just, continue to do what I do. And if this isn't interesting now, I guarantee it will be in the future. So what I'm going to do is to follow through with something I mentioned yesterday. And that was that regarding Albert Pike and his plagiarism of Abby Poyen's 14-year-old poetry, that the history shows, as I understand it, that he was teaching this class in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And then he suddenly left on foot on this long journey ending up in Arkansas. And I'm going to read to you an account of what he said about it. And this is from a book called The Reluctant General, The Life and Times of Albert Pike. It's by Robert Lipscomb Duncan. It was published in 1927. And he says, according to Pike, his decision to go west was based on purely romantic considerations. He explains in his later writings that he fell desperately and hopelessly in love with a blonde beauty named Elizabeth Perkins, and realizing that he could never afford to marry her on a teacher's salary, decided to go far beyond the frontier where he could forget her. This explanation is, of course, in the best Byronic tradition of martyrdom for love, but Pike's justifications for his actions cannot always be taken literally. He was an incurable romantic and at times dramatized facts to make them conform to a more romantic pattern. So you see that Duncan doesn't quite trust Pike's veracity. But he says, he gives him the benefit of the doubt. He says, it is far more likely that the idea of Western travel was just another stage in his rebellious career, more attractive to him, perhaps, because conservative New Englanders were so opposed to it. And this is a pattern I've seen throughout the historical record as scholars deal with these scoundrels and plagiarists. They give them the benefit of the doubt, at least the ones that I've read. They just can't quite bring themselves to admit that this guy is a sociopath. Nobody can deal with sociopaths. They always cut them slack. And the problem with a sociopath is he has zero conscience. You can't cut him any slack at all. Okay? I don't know how to get this across more forcefully to people. When you're dealing with somebody like Edgar Allan Poe and Albert Pike, who were real sociopaths in my judgment, and I have a master's in counseling, so I have a little bit of credentials to say that. These guys, you can't believe a single thing that comes out of their mouths, except you can assume that it's a lie. Okay? You have to assume guilt until proven innocent with a sociopath. It's backwards from everybody else. Now, it so happens, of course, Matthew grew up in that area. See, Matthew grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and Pike grew up in nearby Newburyport, so they knew each other. See, Matthew knew this guy. And Matthew, in 1831 and 1832, he was the de facto editor of the New York Constellation, which was owned by Asa Green. Now, that's not something that historians have figured out. It's something that I discovered on my own. I can't go into all of that. I just have to assert it as fact. When he signed in that paper, he signed with the letter D. Now, that could have stood for a printer's devil, because I think that he was, a printer's assistant before he started working on that paper. It could be for Diogenes, which is the guy that was looking for one single honest man, the Greek figure. Or it could have been for both. But anyway, he signed as D. So I'm going to read you a couple stories that were both, I think, I have to check, both signed with the letter D, which means that Matthew definitely was the author. Now, I don't have the originals on this. I have a photographic copy of one of them, which I think I'll cut in here. So the first one, these two stories tell the real story of why Albert Pike left, okay, in disguise, both written by Matthew. This is typical of him, that he would write faux biographies, phony biographies. He was a master at this particular genre. So this is an early example. He did several of them later on. He wrote, for example, the biography of Mrs. Partington, which was published by Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. That was a collaborative effort, the life and sayings of Mrs. Partington. The biography of Mrs. Partington was written by Matthew. That's another discovery. I've made so many discoveries. Every single one of these discoveries I've made could make a PhD dissertation in itself. Okay, so I don't know what to tell you. All right, so this is from the New York Constellation, January 22nd, 1831 edition. And Matthew was the editor by this time of the paper. And he writes of a country bumpkin who was very bright and ended up becoming a teacher. And this story is very thinly veiled biography of Albert Pike. So I think I'm going to read the first one in its entirety, and then the second one, which is even longer, I'm just going to dip into and maybe read the relevant portions. So this is going to be a long entry, but since nobody's watching these, it doesn't matter. See, now I'm completely free, kind of like not having any standing in academia. I'm totally free to do whatever the heck I want to do. So I want to read this. Jonathan Jenks was one of that large class in New England that support themselves 2/3 of the year by the labor of their hands, and the other third by the exercise of their brains, who are farmers in summer and pedagogues in winter. This alternation of employments is admirably adapted to the condition of country schoolmasters, inasmuch as their intellectual parts, which are apt to become jaded in a literary race of 3 or 4 months, have ample time to rest during the season of agriculture. Well, Matthew, of course, has his tongue firmly in his cheek here. Jonathan exhibited early symptoms of a talent for instruction, so that some supposed he inherited it, in the same way that certain diseases are often heirlooms in a family. But of this we can discover no proof, except that he was descended on the paternal side, not legitimately, however, from one Ichabod Crane, who early emigrated to the state of New York and there became eminent as a teacher. Now, this is Matthew, let's see, was born in 1812. So he's 18 years old when he's writing this, to give you an idea. While yet a boy, Jonathan would sit patiently for hours of a hot afternoon in fly time, enthroned on a milking stool in the center of a lofty dunghill, and lecture to the edification of his barnyard audience. Sometimes a weary cow would repose at his feet and ruminate on his mysterious discourse. At others, the simple sheep would flock round him, as great a loss to divine his meaning as were the ancients that repaired to the oracles to understand their ambiguous expressions. But in process of time, Jonathan grew tired of this new system of instruction. The cattle were too intent on gratifying their animal appetites to give regular attention when their master held forth. His feathered pupils, the geese, not unfrequently testified their respect for his authority by hissing in his face, and a rebellious ram, on whom he undertook to inflict a flagellation, gave him a blow on the head that had well nigh deprived the world of its future services. Tradition says that the next development of Jonathan's genius was in the mathematics. The bellows and checkerboard first betrayed marks in chalk of his progress in the mysteries of addition and subtraction, and next the great barn door was covered with figures, by which he proved that the price of 100 pumpkins at a penny apiece amounted to 100 pennies. By this last performance, His mother was impressed with so exalted an opinion of his skill in figures that she had little difficulty in prevailing on his father to give their son a liberal education. Accordingly, he was sent to an academy where, after remaining one whole quarter, he was examined as to his qualifications and pronounced fully competent to teach all the branches that were required by law to be taught in the public schools of the day. Now, the background on this is that Matthew was denied a higher education. His father wouldn't let him go, and he ended up working around it by, first of all, running away from home and going into journalism. And secondly, Abby, who was 4 years younger and had a full tutored education, agreed to take him on as a student and taught him mostly correspondence, but sometimes in person. I've been into that. That's a separate subject. But Albert Pike went to Harvard, and I think he just partied it away, ran out of money, and had to end up teaching school. And then he, ran to Arkansas, which we'll get into in a minute, because this is a satire on Albert Pike, okay? So to continue, he says, Jonathan now mounted a pair of iron-rimmed spectacles and carried a portentous-looking walking stick. With such recommendations as these, backed by the certificate of his acquirements, he had little difficulty in finding a market for his professional services. See, what happened with Albert Pike was he apparently ran out of money from partying or something, or was cut off in his funds, and he ended up teaching a class in a small town. Okay. The first scene of his labors was a small village at some distance of his own, for Jonathan had wit enough to know that a schoolmaster, no less than a prophet, is not without honor except in his own country. And now Jonathan had reached the topmost round on the ladder of his ambition. He had risen to that exalted station, which is inferior in dignity and importance only to that of the minister. Wherever he came, his ears were saluted with the title of master, and his presence was honored with the highest testimonials of respect. Nothing, in short, was wanting to increase his distinction. He was invited from house to house. Parties and suppers were given on his account, and poor indeed was the family that did not prepare something choice for his entertainment. Now, you could say that this was generic and not just about Albert Pike in general, but it is, trust me, we'll see. But it was among the girls, however, that Jonathan Jenks bestowed the most of his estimation. By associating with them, he hoped to wear off a certain rustic bashfulness, which threatened to be an impediment to his becoming a great man. We need not relate the various little arts which he practiced to win their affections. Suffice it to say that each and all of his patron's daughters fondly believed she had captivated the heart of the matter. And there is some background. I don't have that source, but apparently Albert Pike supposedly enjoyed flirting with the girls where he was being put up. So there is more on that. But there was one in particular who thought she had stronger claims than any to the prize. This was no less a personage than the daughter of his hostess, a stout, buxom lass, note that, a stout, buxom lass who fastened herself on his company whenever he went to church or sleigh riding. Remember the buxom part, because it's going to come in the second story. About this time, Jonathan received an invitation to attend a dance at a neighboring town. I'm sorry, it's coming in this story. About this time, Jonathan received an invitation to attend a dance at a neighboring town. Bouncing Betsy, for that was the name by which his hostess's daughter was called, was to be of the party. And as Bet knew the road and Jonathan did not, she considered it a fair pretext for inviting herself to a seat in the same sleigh with him. Do I need to explain why she's called Bouncing Betsy, or shall I move on? They succeeded in reaching the house by sundown, and no other accident than the upsetting of Betsy in a snowdrift, for which she promised herself satisfaction before the frolic was over. Jonathan, however, laughing in his sleeve at the joke, ushered his fair partner into the room where the company was already assembled. Now, this is kind of interesting. I had noticed this. He's laughing at her having fallen off the sleigh. So already Matthew is kind of hinting at him being a sociopath. Because normally he just wouldn't do that. On the hearth was crackling a rousing fire, round which were seated the musicians, giving notes of dreadful preparation. There were the fiddle, the bass viol, and the clarionet, the first wanting its complement of catgut, the second by being cracked, somewhat gruff in its tones, and the last either hoarse with a cold or asthmatic by age or infirmity, each and all laboring under some calamity which would have driven a Handel or Haydn to the madhouse. Yet no sooner had they struck up the tune than the dance was begun with as right good will and alacrity as though these distinguished performers had been playing for the occasion. Reader, was ever you at a country dance or a dance in the country? If not, we must give you an idea of it, though we would advise you to steal off into the country before the good sleighing is over and witness and participate in it yourself. Know then that in the country such dances as cotillions, waltzes, and quadrilles are seldom, if ever, practiced. To understand these requires more study than suits the taste of the country belles and beaux. There is too much head work and not enough heel work for them. By the way, there's a reference in A Christmas Carol to dancing with the Fezziwigs as being work. So here we have another such reference. I haven't seen anything that Dickens wrote elsewhere where he talks about dancing as work. We ourselves once made the experiment to introduce the cotillion at a country ball. Having marshaled the company into octaves and initiated them, as far as practicable, into the mysteries of the figure, we gave the signal for commencing. In a few moments, one got wrong, and another, till the whole room was in confusion, and we were glad to make our peace with those on whom we were accused of practicing by treating the more disaffected to a glass of something to drink. I doubt that's actual autobiography, but it's possible. I don't think Matthew particularly liked dancing either. But you never was at a country dance, and are impatient, perhaps, to be let into its description. Well, then, the company is no sooner assembled than cards are distributed among the belles, which are numbered to correspond to those given to the beaux. The drawing then commences. A manager steps forth into the middle of the room and announces, "Number 1 gentleman and number 1 lady," and so on till the members are exhausted. The couples take their places in the order they are called, forming a double line from one end of the hall to the other. The greater the length of the ballroom, the longer, of course, is the dance, for there is no cessation till each couple has led down once at least. It is considered, indeed, a great feat to, quote, dance down a partner, that is, to tire one out so that he is forced to quit the dance. The tavern ballroom is accordingly made long and narrow, somewhat on the proportions of a yardstick, so as to give full scope to this operation. On the present occasion, however, as the ballroom was somewhat scanty in its dimensions, the dance was led down a long entry or passageway. Jonathan had thus far acquitted himself to his entire satisfaction. He had plied his feet most nimbly, and though the sweat streamed off his face, he had avoided the mortification of being, quote, danced down. He now stood up for a new dance and bouncing Betsy for his partner. When it came their turn to lead down, she seized his hands with a hearty grip, and crying out to the musicians to play faster, whirled him along with the rapidity of a steamboat. Jonathan, to use a sailor's phrase, was now under way at the rate of 10 knots an hour. Away he went, borne by his partner like another Mazeppa on a wild horse. Away, away, away. The foot of the passage, which terminated the dance, was now nearly reached, and Jonathan congratulated himself on the prospect of a short respite from his fatigue. But his partner still urged her course with unabated ardor. Round and round she twirled him, as though he was a mere man of straw. Suddenly, however, he was carried by the centrifugal force of his motion against a door at the foot of the entry. It flew open, and he fell, he knew not whither. On recovering, he found himself upon a heap of potatoes, with the huge mass of bouncing Betsy piled upon him. The noise of the fall, so I guess she's a little heavy. The noise of the fall brought the whole company to the spot. Betsy was picked up with no other injury than the disarrangement of her dress, and the honor was duly conferred upon her of having danced down the master. As for Jonathan, poor fellow, when he found his way out of the cellar, he stole off alone in his sleigh, leaving his fair partner to find her way home as she could. So great was his mortification that he threw up his school and for the rest of the winter took to shoemaking in his native village. Now, there's no mention of leaving town. There's no mention of, I mean, obviously they're kind of involved briefly romantically. And we have Betsy, who is Elizabeth Perkins. But the thing is that I can now triangulate that. That's not real strong evidence, but I can triangulate it with a story he wrote almost a year later in the same newspaper, same signature D. This is January 21st, 1832. And here I guess he says, well, posterity isn't going to be absolutely sure to get the message, so I've got to reinforce it. I really think he was thinking ahead for these things. He couldn't very well come out with this at the time, but he could tell people in the future what was going on, I believe. So here he says, this is an introduction, and I don't really understand what he's referring to because I couldn't find the original. It says, the following story was originally published in the New England Galaxy some 6 or 7 years since. Now, I've told you that Matthew began publishing in the New England Galaxy in Boston in 1825, which would be, 7 years earlier. But I don't have access to that full publication. I was not able to find it. When I first read this particular piece, I didn't know that Matthew had started in 1825 that early, see? So I was trying to kind of make some excuses as to why he was exaggerating everything, but no, it's probably quite literal because he was, in fact, publishing in the New England Galaxy 6 or 7 years earlier. It's probably there, and I'd love to find it. So it's something that he wrote himself. However, the way he puts it here is the following story was originally published in the New England Galaxy some 6 or 7 years since, and is now, after the manner of certain articles in a contemporary hebdomadal, republished in this paper with such amendments as suggested themselves to the author in the reperusal of an early production. Now, the actual events would have taken place in 1830. That's when Pike was teaching this class in Newburyport. So basically, I think what he's saying is that he wrote a generic story about a schoolmaster in 1825 or 1826. And then after Albert Pike pulled his shenanigans, Matthew decided to rewrite it specifically about Pike. That's what I think he's saying. Matthew writes a lot in code, and you have to learn how to interpret it. Now, one of the kinds of code that Matthew uses is introductory lines from poetry. Here we have, first off, the title is No Ear for Music. And this is a full autobiography by someone who's tone deaf. That's the premise. It's not really about that. It's about Albert Pike, who is not tone deaf, but soul deaf, which is to say sociopathic. So the quote tells you what the real subject is, okay? Because under the title, No Ear for Music, the quote, which comes from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, or is adapted from it, says, the man that hath no music in himself, and is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. Let no such man be trusted. Now, what he's done is, no ear for music, he's told us through the quote that is a metaphor for being a sociopath. Okay? Let me read this quote again so you'll see what I mean. The man that hath no music in himself and is not moved with concord of sweet sounds is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. Let no such man be trusted. That's the only place that he reveals what this metaphor is about. The rest of it, he plays it straight as though he is a tone-deaf man, okay? So we're put on notice in the quote. Now, I'm not going to go through this again. It's basically the same story. This is a country schoolmaster. There's probably clues in this. There's a lot of clues. As a matter of fact, at some point, he flips over to talking about Abby. This is where I get this is where I extrapolate from that Abby went through this terrible time before she attended the class, that she was a wild nature mystic that wandered around. And later on, I found a poem that she wrote about her childhood that portrays her wandering about all day in nature looking for the fairies. See, so here he has her listening to frogs at the frog pond, you know, although he says it's him and he says he's tone deaf and the only thing he appreciates is the frogs in the frog pond. That's actually about Abby, I think, wandering around in nature and listening to the frogs in the frog pond. So in his pretense as a man who's tone deaf, he tells this story of how Abby went to the class and what Albert Pike did with this girl Betsy and how he ran, see, how they got involved. So I won't read the whole thing again because it's very difficult to understand. The code is very difficult to understand. But basically, it's the same thing. This schoolmaster takes this girl, one of his students, to a dance and humiliates himself. So I'm going to read the last couple of paragraphs here. The fatal night was at last arrived. Dismissing school at an earlier hour than usual, I hastened to my abode, and with a trembling hand, quote, sacrificed to the graces. It was one of those cold moonlight nights which, are peculiar to New England, and my Dulcinea and I enveloped ourselves in a goodly number of buffalo skins, and thus accoutered with her father's own horse and sleigh, for the good man had proffered me the use of them as soon as he heard of the notice I had taken of his daughter, we drove off for the dance. There was but one sleigh bell to our establishment, and it seemed to dance and exult at my approaching destiny. As we drew near the tavern, the music and dancing greeted our ears. It was, I've got a typo in here. I'm going to mark it while I'm here. Every time I read these things, I find a typo. As we drew near the tavern, the music and dancing greeted our ears. It produced such an exhilarating effect on my companion that she kicked off the buffaloes and began dancing in the sleigh. I cannot tell how I gallanted her into the drawing room, for so impatient was she to get there that she carried me rather than I waited upon her. But we were no sooner there than, flinging off her overgarments, she darted into the hall and was footing it the next moment with the young fellow in the dance. I prepared myself more deliberately, for I knew what to expect. At length I got ready and was ushered into the hall by a country pedagogue, not college educated, who stuck as close to me as if we were classmates. On one side of the room was seated a long row of country beauties like wallflowers, all arrayed in their best. Opposite sat the young men, who were casting occasionally knowing glances at their respective sweethearts. The tickets were now distributed, and I was the lucky holder of a fine, sprightly girl. She was all life and could not keep her feet still a moment. But when it was our turn to lead down the dance, she grasped my hands and whirled me along with the rapidity of lightning. As long as she guided me, I went well enough. But when left to myself, I was in my movements like a ship without a rudder. I could not keep step. I got far before the others, treading on the toes of those I passed and making sad work with frocks and finery. Here we have the work reference again. At length I came to a dead stand and was obliged to retire to my seat, covered with confusion. My partner in misery, as if to console me for my misfortunes, whispered in my ear, "You missed a figure or so coming down. I guess you haven't got no ear for music, sir." I was about to reply, but a flourish of the fiddlestick put every idea in my head to flight. I danced no more the rest of the evening and attended no more balls the rest of that winter. And he goes on. Now, you know that Albert Pike went into the military, became a general in the South. So he says, I might now go on to relate my adventures in the military line and to describe the evils I encountered when I came to shoulder a musket by having no ear for music. How that I disordered the marching, barked the heels of my neighbors, and lost the office of corporal by being unable to keep step with the music. But I have wearied my readers too long, I fear, with the recital of my sufferings, in which the larger part of them cannot sympathize. I have told a story which some will disbelieve and others will deride. Now, why would anybody disbelieve this? because he's actually talking about how Albert Pike was humiliated and left Newburyport, see? And then he quotes Lord Byron. He says, I know this is unpopular. I know 'tis blasphemous. Well, Matthew loved Lord Byron and quoted him at every opportunity. So this is also typical for Matthew. So he says, so the quote is, I know this is unpopular. I know 'tis blasphemous. And he continues, to speak one word or harbor a single thought against the all-pervading, soul-ravishing powers of music. But I have suffered so much by music, have been persecuted so long with singing, from the cradle to the grave, no, not to the grave, but I shall soon be there if my misfortunes continue, that though it do split me, I must speak, which he means not about music, but about Albert Pike. I have endured not only the miseries which I have detailed, but have been taunted by the thoughtless, upbraided by the wise, laughed at by the young, abhorred by the aged, and treated with ridicule and contempt wherever I have come, merely because I am so unfortunate as to have, quote, no ear for music. So what I think he means is that every time he tries to tell people that Albert Pike is a sociopath, they laugh at him, which you may be doing today. But if you juxtapose and triangulate these two stories together about Bouncing Betsy, who was Elizabeth Perkins, and how they went to a dance and he was humiliated and he quit, basically, it's pretty clear why Albert Pike left Newburyport and went on foot to Arkansas. He must have, maybe he either got her pregnant, or in that day, I think if you had sex with a girl and it was discovered, you were expected to marry her, to kind of save her honor. So he didn't want to marry her. She probably wasn't his intellectual equal, and he ran. That's my guess. So this is the same man that plagiarized Abby's poetry when she was in his class. So you get some idea of his character, and then you can look at the other charges against him, and you can figure that they were probably true. Okay, that's as long as I need to make this, since nobody's watching anyway. And I'm sure I got into YouTube stats, and if you get into the analytics, you can see how long people are watching your videos by average. Now, the average is a little tricky because some people will watch for 1 minute and click out, and some people will watch the whole thing, and when it averages out, it ends up being in half. But even my documentaries, only the first 18 minutes is being watched by most people. So, and these video blogs, we're talking like, I don't know, a minute or two. So these 40-minute video blogs, nobody's watching more than 5 minutes. So I'm now talking to nobody. Now, I may very well be talking to people in the future. I hope so. Maybe there's 1 or 2 people that watch these. So those few of you who watched, I will say thank you for watching. I wanted to add an addendum. I've said before in earlier blog entries that when Matthew wanted to convey a secret in code, he would very often embed it in the poetry of the lines that he quoted. And they wouldn't be necessarily in those lines, but they would be in the context of the source that he used. If you would go back to the original source and read the lines around the lines that he quoted, that would give you the secret. So when he opens it up and titles this No Ear for Music, and he starts with this quote from Shakespeare, the man that hath no music in himself and is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, that's tone deafness, but then he ties that with sociopathic tendencies, is fit for treason, stratagems, and spoils. Let no such man be trusted. Tying those two together, it works both ways. It means that he's accused or characterized Albert Pike as a sociopath, but it also means that he did not have the sensitivity and spirituality to write the poetry that he claimed for himself. What he's saying is what I said, there's no possible way that he could have written those poems that he plagiarized from Abby Poyen. Now, when we get to the end of the piece, where he quotes Byron, he's quoting Byron from The Vision of Judgment. And what he quotes is, I know this is unpopular, I know 'tis blasphemous, but the larger context, if you go back to the source, is, I know this is unpopular, I know 'tis blasphemous, I know one may be damned for hoping no one else may e'er be so. This is a statement of universalism, the universalist belief that all will be saved. So Mathew was a huge fan of Byron, and he defended Byron, as I mentioned in one of my earlier entries, even from a very young age. So he saw Byron as being actually spiritual and more spiritually advanced and more genuine than the pious Christians. And John Greenleaf Whittier blasted Byron as a heretic. But the point here is that Mathew is struggling with sociopaths, like we all do. He believes that there's some good in everybody and that all can be saved. And yet the sociopath is a standing challenge to that belief, because it doesn't seem possible to save one of those. They don't have anything in them that you could appeal to, see? So, of course, at this stage, Mathew did not accept reincarnation, and reincarnation is the answer to this, because if a sociopath is dead to his conscience in this life, it doesn't mean that he or she will be in all subsequent lives. It means, in my opinion, that the person has gone down that path so far that they've now inherited a body that doesn't have the capacity to feel, for anybody. But that won't be permanent. But so long as you're locked into a one life only scenario, the sociopath definitely presents a standing challenge to the idea that all will be saved. So that's why he quotes this, because he's trying to cut Albert Pike a break and hope that he, can be saved, that there's some good in him. But he's making it very clear that Pike could not possibly have written those poems that he plagiarized from